The speaker is Michael Barber, St. Louis University and the Society for the Phenomenology of Religious Experience. And the title of the talk, The COVID Virus as Imposed Relevance. Michael, please.
Okay, I'd like to thank, first of all, Olga, Jason, and Michelle for setting up this whole conference. I think it's wonderful. Also, I've posted my document on chat, so if you'd like to read along, you can. I've kept this within a 3,000 word limit, which I hope will be just 20 minutes. Okay. COVID-19, the well-informed citizen and the theoretical province of meaning. Part 1, the well-informed citizen. Alfred Schutz's essay, The Well-Informed Citizen, presents a framework for understanding the current COVID-19 crisis. Schutz begins emphasizing realms of unknowing that surround scientific inquiry and pragmatic everyday life in which we pursue pragmatic goals without needing or wanting to inquire. For instance, how complicated objects like cell phones work. Schutz constructs 3 types. First, the expert, whose knowledge is restricted to a limited field in which he or she possesses clear and distinct opinions based on warranted assumptions. The second, the man in the street, grasped recipes for bringing forth in typical situations typical results by typical means, and such knowledge is sufficiently precise for practical purposes at hand, which, when systematically realized, make possible his pursuit of happiness. He lives naively in his and his in-group's interests, but these intrinsic relevances face challenges when he or his group encounter imposed relevances. Schutz writes, "We are, however, not only centers of spontaneity gearing into the world, who can create changes within it, but also the mere passive recipients of events beyond our control, which occur without our interference. Imposed upon us as relevant are situations and events which are not connected with interests chosen by us, which do not originate in acts of our discretion, and which we have to take just as they are, without any power to modify them by our spontaneous activities, except by transforming the relevances thus imposed into intrinsic relevances. While that remains unachieved, we do not consider the imposed relevances as being connected with our spontaneously chosen goals. Because they are imposed upon us, they remain unclarified and rather incomprehensible. The man in the street takes imposed relevances as elements of the situation to be defined or conditions for his course of action without seeking to understand their origin and structure. This is so because he is governed by sentiment rather than information and prefers, Schutz says, the comic pages of newspapers to the foreign news, the radio quizzes to news commentaries. Between the expert and the man on the street, one finds the third type, the well-informed citizen who does not strive to be an expert, but resists acquiescing in vague recipe knowledge and searches instead for reasonably founded opinions in fields of immediate concern which do not bear directly upon her purposes at hand. The well-informed citizen endeavors to gather knowledge about the origin and sources of relevances imposed upon her and restricts the zone of the irrelevant as minimally as possible, since from such a zone, anonymous powers can emerge and overtake her. Finally, the well-informed citizen looks for information by consulting eyewitnesses, insiders whose relevances differ from her own because of access to a context she lacks, analysts who structure information according to relevances like her own, and commentators who group information in line with relevances considerably different from her own. To conclude, Schutz insists that knowledge socially approved by one's in-group is more readily embraced and held, and he bemoans how methods of public opinion polling end up conferring social approval upon the views of the uninformed man in the street at the expense of informed opinion, thereby imposing such views upon the better informed members of the community and undermining democracy because of a mistaken understanding of what majority rule means. Okay, so that's the well-informed citizen. Part 2, the applicability of the well-informed citizen to the present situation. The spread of the coronavirus constitutes an imposed relevance with which one must come to terms by, quote, transferring the relevances thus imposed into intrinsic relevances. Such transformation occurs in a varied ways. For those who conceive the coronavirus as highly contagious and lethal, it threatens their own relevant system, such as the protection of loved ones or other persons, or continued pursuit of career goals. And they come to terms with this imposed relevance by wearing masks, practicing self-distancing, safe distancing, and careful hand washing and home sheltering, all of which entail adopting new sets of relevances, purchasing masks, learning Zoom. Others' highest relevances might consist in pursuing life, working and socializing as usual, and so they might resist protective measures, wearing masks or social distancing. But correlatively and perhaps simultaneously with their ranking of relevances, these actors often interpret through typifications the pandemic as, quote, less threatening, thinking that it is statistically improbable that they will be infected, that they will be able to survive any infection without much suffering, or that the coronavirus is no more dangerous or contagious than the seasonal influenza. However, these latter beliefs clearly contradict the information provided by experts. Similarly, those minimizing the virus's threat have produced outright false claims, such as that hydrochloroquine can prevent or treat those with COVID-19. Schutz's account of the well-informed citizen seems a bit outdated, I think, perhaps too dependent on the print media, when arguing that the man in the street reads only the comic pages and is indifferent to the structures of relevance. Nowadays, those who, like the man in the street, exhibit little esteem for expert opinions are not indifferent, but they assertively challenge experts with reasons and arguments articulated and socially approved in their in-groups. Those both favoring and not favoring protective measures against the virus consult social media and cable channels in which analyses are provided, at times from experts, from which their fellow in-group members draw. Given the polarized nature of such media, television, and political discourse, it would be less likely now to find widespread examples of well-informed citizens who, from their own viewpoint, by consulting commentators whose relevances are considerably different from their own. It's hard to find those kinds of citizens now. There are limits to expert knowledge whose systems are often separated from each other by abysses and not necessarily integrated with each other, and scientists themselves do not fully understand the life world they start from. Some experts assume that their discipline is the only relevant one, while others defer to experts in other fields, as must take place in a pandemic where interdisciplinary cooperation is essential, public health and economics. Finally, those making final decisions must do so from beyond the narrow field of experts, since such decision makers alone can determine the ends to be realized as opposed to experts who focus more narrowly on the means to the ends. Hence Clemenceau's comment that war was too important a business to be left exclusively to the generals. But it is one thing to indicate the limits of experts' knowledge and another to attempt to disqualify their inputs. Such an endeavor to discredit an expert recently occurred when political functionaries argued that Dr. Anthony Fauci, the supervisor of the US pandemic response, has made many mistakes, stating first that masks were unnecessary and then changing his mind when new data surfaced. But the revisions on the basis of newly emerging evidence is thoroughly consistent with scientific methodology and affords no grounds for rejecting an expert's recommendation or impugning her expert status. Fauci has even received numerous death threats, the ultimate attempt to dismiss an expert. This ferocity against experts no doubt results from both the polarization of in-groups that, according to their different relevances, develop and disseminate via social media and cable television, socially approved beliefs and defenses, and from the invasiveness of the restrictions recommended in response to the pandemic. Schutz's man in the street exhibits no such animosity toward the experts and appears only indifferent to their findings and willing to rely on his unclarified views as long as they sustain his pursuit of happiness. So the fury that we see can even lead to deny any relevance of expertise at all, or to dispute even the existence of expertise. Such an approach would undermine Schutz's essay, insofar as the rejection of expertise in toto would elevate all men in the street to experts, dismantle any difference between experts and non-experts, and leave no one for well-informed citizens to consult. A similar strategy appears in classifying any opinions opposed to one's own as fake news, thereby relativizing all news reports to one's own in-group and its relevances, thereby eliminating the possibility of any accurate or objective reports at all. Schutz correctly observes, it is our interest at hand that motivates all our thinking, projecting, acting, and therewith establishes the problems to be solved by our thought and the goals to be attained by our actions. But to understand better the conflicts and fissures that the corona pandemic introduces, within Schütz's typology in The Well-Informed Citizen, one needs to supplement that essay with his theory of the relationship between everyday pragmatic reality and multiple realities, which is another part of his theory that I'm now going to turn to. In the first half of On Multiple Realities, Schütz depicts the paramount reality of pragmatic everyday life, of which non-pragmatic provinces of meaning such as scientific theory, so important for our experts, and religious experience are modifications. In everyday lives, our lives are governed by the pragmatic motive that impels us to dominate that world through working, action in the outer world based upon a project and characterized by intention, the intention to bring about the projected state of affairs by bodily movements. A deep genetic stratum within this everyday effort to master the world is an actor's sense that I can do it again. And immediately after introducing this Husserlian concept into his own analysis, Schütz discusses locomotion, by which one can exchange one's hic for an illic, bringing within one's reach what had been distant. From a genetic standpoint, one can envision infants who are already struggling to acquire a vast repertoire of behaviors to navigate the physical, perceptual, social, cultural world they were born into, discovering a powerful sense of I can, simply by crawling from one location to another. Sean Gallagher's recent work on inactivism stresses the importance of such motor intentionality and traces moral abstract conceptual processes back to genetic origins and basic bodily movements. Even the gradually learned capacity to subsume unfamiliar experiences under systems of the concepts, typifications, and routinized patterns in one's stock of knowledge exemplifies the I can. By progressively typifying the world, subsuming what is unfamiliar under typifications, an actor realizes Weberian rationalization and the disenchantment of the world. Progressive typification links with the everyday pursuit of control, insofar as it achieves the transformation of an uncontrollable and unintelligible world into an organization which we can understand and therefore master. Thus, even discovering something atypical, one encounters an imposed, even doing that, one encounters an imposed relevance with which one must come to terms, usually by subsuming it some way within one's stock of knowledge. For instance, Schütz deploys the example of unexpectedly finding what looks like a coiled rope or a coiled snake in a corner of one's room as the experience of an imposed topical relevance, since one is compelled to discontinue present activity, attend to what is given, and determine under which typification it ought to fall, since if it is a snake, it could cost one's life. The appearance of the virus constitutes a similar imposed topical relevance, which people seek to come to terms with by typifying it as, quote, more lethal and contagious than standard influenza and in need of major behavioral adjustments, or as just like the regular influenza and not needing many special adaptations. There are then ascending levels of mastery from locomotion to typifications to really higher level typifications by all of which one or one's group ensures that their ranked relevances are fulfilled and protected. Hence, to use the example from The Well-Informed Citizen, should groups with destructive nuclear weapons threaten to bring us under their control, rendering us less and less masters in our own right to define what is and what is not relevant to us, we might have to resort to some defensive measure in order to deal with this imposed relevance that would threaten all our other relevances. In another setting, I've referred to such meta-level strategies as hyper-mastery. Similarly, the coronavirus stands as an imposed relevance threatening our systems of relevance, but likewise, the policies recommended by experts, such as wearing masks, social distancing, and other hygienic measures, might endanger the system of relevance of some in-groups, even more than the virus itself, at least in their view. This takes place to such a degree that they might seek to destroy or undermine such policies taken to interfere with their pursuit of happiness and the manners in which they master and secure their lives. There is at work in pragmatic everyday life a dynamic bent on self-mastery, a domination of one's circumstances, of securing life as one knows it for one's in-group. This dynamic, begun in childhood and continually developing as life progresses, resorts to higher and higher level strategies such as erecting entire media empires or mobilizing extensive high-level political action, all for the sake of securing hypermastery, that is, to ensure that one's established life is not interfered with or undermined. After describing everyday life, Schütz turns to non-pragmatic finite provinces of meaning, fantasying, dreaming, and theoretical science, whose cognitive features include a specific epoche by which one breaks with pragmatic everyday life, and a form of spontaneity by which one embraces non-pragmatic relevances. Hence, scientific theorizing does not serve any practical purpose. Its aim is not to master the world, but to observe and possibly to understand it. While people in everyday life pause to adopt theoretical attitudes, to consider problems, or meditate on public opinion, such reflective enclaves are performed usually for practical ends, and they differ in their guiding relevance from the scientific theoretical province of meaning. The prototype of the scientific knowledge for which experts strive and which well-informed citizens participate when they assess expert recommendations and expose themselves to insiders and commentators whose relevances differ considerably from their own. So the paradigm of the well-informed citizen is undermined, I think, when the scientific theoretical epoche and its relevances lose motivational force, and people are guided only by the intrinsic relevances of an in-group focused on ensuring mastery of its environment and the happiness such mastery procures. This failure becomes clear to the extent that one or one's in-group authors or endorses false beliefs, not accurate to the reality at hand. However much the protagonists of such an in-group argue or appeal to evidence after the patterns found in social media or cable television, they give the impression of inhabiting the province of scientific theorizing, but they are in fact pursuing a project of hypermastery to protect lower-level intrinsic relevances. In effect, they remain within the province of meaning of everyday life and its relevances and subordinate the province of scientific theorizing to its purposes. They don the trappings of science without its core values, thereby subverting it. Okay, so what I've done is I've talked about what the well-informed citizen is, applied it to the situation of the coronavirus, and then I'm trying to say, well, we still need these finite provinces of meaning, particularly science, and religion's one of those too. And now I'm going to try to talk about what's called radical pragmatism and the province, to conclude, the province of religious experience. In reflections on the problems of relevance, Schutz imagines a radical pragmatism that would reduce any knowledge to its usefulness for coming to terms with the surrounding world, and that would take the success or failure of doing so as its criteria of truth for knowledge. In this view, there would be no other reality than everyday reality based on working. The view explained above, exploding the framework of the well-informed citizen, amounts to such a radical pragmatism, subsuming the province of scientific theory into pragmatic everyday life, reducing argumentation and theorizing to nothing more than an effort to establish mastery or hypermastery. However, to demonstrate that radical pragmatism is true, one would have to appeal to eidetic intuitions about what philosophy and truth are, and to do this, one would have to appeal to the Husserlian ideal of the evidential having of eidetic claims as part of a project shaped self-responsibly according to the ultimate evidences it has produced. So even if you're going to make a case for radical pragmatism, you have to get out of it to make the case, because you have to go to theory. In pursuing evidentially based eidetic claims, one is not testing those views for their usefulness in coming to terms with the world, and hence, as Schutz observes, pragmatistic theory of knowledge can never explain what the pragmatistic philosopher does. If one needs corroboration about whether scientific theory seeks to observe and possibly understand the world rather than master it, one might consult one's very listening to this lecture and ask whether one judged the truth of the lecture based on its claims finding fulfillment in the evidential having, or of their facilitating its facilitating mastery in everyday life. The former seems to be clearly the case. You don't consult what I'm saying here to see if it's going to make the world function more effectively. You're actually assessing it for its truth. Finally, in the case of the pandemic, several religious approaches have converged with the pragmatic undermining of the ultimate relevances of the theoretical scientific province of meaning by insisting that, despite scientific evidence, the imposed relevance of the coronavirus is not dangerous, and that one should not continue to control and maintain one's everyday dominance, and that one should continue to control and maintain one's everyday dominance of everyday life as always, including participating in religious services, because God will protect those who refuse to be cowed by the virus. Such a view simply bypasses any scientific consideration of the origin or structure of imposed relevances, as the man in the street might do. Further, such perspectives press God into the service of maintaining intact their everyday life pattern of mastery, since no adjustment is required on their part, and since they just presume that God will support what they have already determined ought not be touched. However, if the province of religious experience involves ranking the religious absolute itself above such pragmatic relevances, as I think it does, and even allowing confidence in the absolute to liberate one and one's group from the anxieties about pragmatic success, such an approach would share with the province of theoretical science a de-absolutization of the pursuit of mastery. Such a religious outlook then might be disposed to take seriously scientific findings regarding the pandemic as a first step to be followed by discernment about the religious significance of the virus, the religious and ethical responsibilities involved in dealing with this imposed relevance, recognized in the fullness of its imposedness, and the integration of this imposed relevance with one's group's intrinsic relevances. Unlike theories of secularization that pit religious experience against science, this paradigm of religious experience could be an ally with science in circumscribing pragmatic relevances bent on mastery, in not dismissing the findings of science, and in making use of them to illuminate the imposed relevance of the pandemic, to be accommodated within the system of one's intrinsic religious relevances. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's wonderful to see it all organized so that the overall picture makes sense. And I think that Schutz framework is never fails, you know. It's
Yeah,
just,
those
yeah.
are great of his, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So the floor is open to questions, please. I don't see anything in the chat, so maybe if you want to just give a visual sign, I'll see you on screen. Just give people a couple of moments to come to.
May I?
Yes, you
Michael
sure may.
speaking. Michael, thanks a lot for this presentation. Yeah, I can only follow up on Olga. It's really good to see how the Schützian framework can be applied and how one can make sense of it, even in times that sometimes may make people think that this is outdated. So I think you gave a good proof of exactly that. How can we make use of that for a situation which has significantly changed the problematic index of eidetic intuitions? So what is relevant and what is not relevant is the most essential question in determining how we make use of our concepts understood in terms of something that can be used to implement categorical distinctions and so on and so forth. So there's this index of problematicity which can change over time and which necessarily changes over time. So I think this is Schütz's understanding of the eidos as something that is contingently but structurally related to how we perceive the world is something that is really important. And it's something that the transcendental phenomenologists have to accept in some sense. So like Merleau-Ponty says, every idea has a geographical leeway and things like that. So that's something that comes very close to that, I think. And then comes your idea of the hypermastery, which strikes me as really fantastic extension of Schütz's work, in fact. And if I understood it rightly, then you try to put forward a hypothesis that in some sense, correct me if I'm wrong with that in some sense wants to reconcile science and religion, because they both are different but structurally analogous provinces of meaning. And what is really interesting is Schütz's take on multiple realities in reframing it in terms of finite provinces of meaning. Right. So that gives us a clue in order to understand how science and religion might work together, because right. They don't have anything at hand and in hands that would allow us to transcend to, well, what we project into the starry heaven above us. Neither in some hinter world or something like that. So I think, yeah, that's simply a very interesting extension of Schütz, which can help us perhaps also in terms of fake news and what you brought in to reshape our conceptual take on the phenomenology of the social world. So thanks for that. I mean, that wasn't really a question, that was rather a remark, and
Right.
I tried to see if I'm on the right track in what
If I just could add, you're absolutely right. What I'm saying, I think, is that not only do we have our masteries in everyday life, where, I mean, our relevances in everyday life where we're trying to pragmatically master the world, but we get so bent on protecting our in-group that actually now you begin to erect these higher and higher structures, and then they become relevant. So now we've got a nuclear arms conflict with the Russians, right? And look at all that's just to protect against bomb, you know, and so now you've got, and these things can become quite dangerous or sick or anything like that. So, but some of them may be necessary too. I mean, maybe you do need a certain kind of structure to protect people at a very high level, but that's all on the pragmatic side. And then, as you say, what I find interesting, he's got all these non-pragmatic finite provinces of meaning, like science and religion and art. And I'm seeing them as how they would be maybe used in this case together, where you might say the scientist tries to present from pragmatic interest to look at what the facts, what's true, in a sense, to describe what's there. And that would be similar in some ways to what religion tries to do. It tries to resist that pragmatic tendency to mastery and open oneself to God, as it were. Art would be the same. So I'm just thinking of ways in which the non-pragmatic finite provinces of meaning can team up together to act against the pragmatic world of everyday life in a way. And I see that all at work in this virus business. I really do.
Just one quick procedural remark. Would it be okay with everybody to extend the period of questions and answers by 5 minutes? We're at the end of our talks and we can run a little bit late without affecting the program henceforth. So if there are no objections, I'll give it extra 5 minutes. Yeah, okay, good. All right, Carl, please, Carl Rashke.
Yeah, I appreciate this very much, and particularly bringing up Schutz. I hadn't thought about Schutz in quite a while, but the question I want to ask is more a kind of challenge, because in light of an event that just happened with the death of the French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, and his theory of both immaterial labor and digitization, and the way in which we might call the structure of relevance has been totally transmuted, if not rendered basically unrecognizable by digital technology in the last 20 years. And of course, I mean, this is probably a generalization. People like Schultz and Heidegger were working from a standpoint that, you know, might be called a standpoint of Alltäglichkeit, of everydayness and so forth. But the question is, everydayness today is basically this confusion, this vortex we live in every day of information. This was Stiegler's whole criticism of quote expertise. Is expertise isn't really expertise. Expertise is simply people posturing because they have access to data. And we, you know, and it's kind of interesting that empirical science now we call data science, but the question is, what do you do with data? And that was basically Stiegler's whole argument and so forth. So my question is, or it's both an observation and a question. Yes, a lot of the confusion about how people behave is because people aren't trusting experts, because expertise itself is in such disarray. We don't know what expertise is. I mean, there's been some studies now that are going on about the genesis of the idea of fake news, which was interestingly was a trope that was started as a criticism of Trump and, you know, his rhetoric when he was elected, and then Trump, you know, appropriated and turned against his critics, and now it's become a kind of general term for essentially, you know, determining what is essentially impossibility and indeterminacy of factuality. Now, Stiegler, of course, wasn't surprised by all of this. He says, well, this is exactly when you understand knowledge is information. You know, that was the whole idea of the internet, the information superhighway, as it was called back in the 90s, that somehow information would transform the world. You know, information wants to be free. This is part of our kind of essential freedom as human beings. But in a sense, everybody can, in a sense, create their own structure of relevance. And so my question is you know, is this really is this really a social issue of the failure of authority or expertise, or are we really in a whole new terrain? Are we on a strange planet, which is the post-digital planet, which Stiegler, was beginning to really radically analyze in ways just before his death?
Thank you.
So I think, I would argue, yeah, true. One of the things that the well-informed citizen has to do is to evaluate different experts, right? And we do it all the time. If I say I want a second opinion, a doctor tells me I'm going to get operated on, I want to get a second opinion. I consult several, and that's exactly what we do. But I see that very consultation, that very, and even on the stuff on the virus, I was much more willing to consult a friend of mine who's got a PhD from Michigan in public health than watch Tucker Carlson, right? And so it just strikes me, yeah, we do evaluate, we do make those decisions, and if we do, maybe they're wrong, and maybe there's finite problems, and maybe there's got to be a lot of fallibility about that. But I see the very effort to evaluate experts as itself indicative that we do recognize some difference between the kind of knowledge some people have and others don't, and that I don't.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, so I'm torn between the desire to comment and calling the next questioner, and I think I'll stick with duty. So Jason, and then Bill, and then Vijay. Please be mindful, we have about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Yeah, so Jason.
Yeah, I'll read my question.
Yeah.
Hello. I'll read my question very briefly. As you see it in the chat box, I'm not sure if you have access to that, but simply the question of, can Schutz help us navigate this tension between calling our expertise into question, for Hannah Arendt drew attention to, but also trusting their expertise. As you mentioned, we want to get second opinion. We want to check with people who are experts about specific subjects so we can make wise decisions and discernment.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I would just say, yeah, as I read what Schutz says, for instance, in The Well-Informed Citizen, you're consulting all these different kind of people, some of who share your relevances, some of whom don't. If anything, too, one of the things I was thinking as you just asked your question is when in his essay on equality, where he talks about, for instance, about African Americans, and one of the things that's coming up in that essay is for instance, right after the Supreme Court passes Plessy versus Ferguson, which imposes separate but equal facilities, Justice Brown comes forward as a Supreme Court justice and says, now I'll tell you the African Americans are going to say that this makes them inferior. We didn't mean anything like that. So right away you see, this is what I call hypermastery. At a higher level, he not only makes the decision, he gives it's a looking glass. He interprets how the other persons are going to interpret what he said and shows that they're wrong before they even had a chance to read it. So it strikes me right away, it would be really important to talk to African Americans because you see immediately what's going on here, right? Or at least you should have that suspicion. I think Schutz certainly does. And so with Hannah Arendt, I would have said, I would have been really, I think people should have been really suspicious about what Nazi bureaucrats are saying and be concerned about what's happening to our Jewish neighbors. Why are they disappearing? Like in the movie Shoah, the people say, well, they just disappeared, well, why, and why, again, if you're the well-informed citizen really wants to get to the basis of this thing, I think. And so therefore there's a kind of, I actually think it's a kind of close, maybe it's a close connection with Husserl's idea that you've got to, sort of ask the question to its ultimate end in a way. Rationality is to do that.
Can I just step in because it resonates really with Jason and Mike's response to Jason's question. I think that the social typification is changing and what we see as experts is changing. CDS and probably Fauci were co-opted in the beginning to the denial or into the denial of masks. And it's not possible that the society wouldn't intuit it on some level. It wasn't the functioning of an expert. It's some kind of a different role, and I think that it may be a little bit more complicated. So anyway, we have to move to a question from Bill, and then Vijay. So Bill.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. So, yes, thank you, Michael. And so the one of the things I wanted to ask about is this activation of hypermastery. And so I'm just going to talk about what I know. And I live in a very rural area of the country. And there are a lot of people that are probably some of these, I don't know what you want to call them. I don't want to say deniers, but they're practicing different things. And they may or may not object to wearing face masks and things like that. So, but the thing I want to point out is that these farmers, and that's where I live around, they may, for various reasons, resist wearing masks. But at the same time, they will listen slavishly to what their county extension agent tells them about what amendments to add to soils and things like that. So that's the question I basically have to you is when is it that this hypermastery gets activated? Because it's selectively being activated. It's not activated against the scientific realm. It may have something to do with the fact that they don't regard these scientists who they are hearing on TV and the like as part of their community. I don't know. So anyway, I'm asking, that's the question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I mentioned even in the course of the paper that the scientific prescriptions that are given in the case of the virus are pretty invasive. So they're different maybe than the things about that they might consult their county experts on certain things. But I also think it probably comes from the fact that it's government, okay, that's got behind some of this other stuff. And actually, I think there's a kind of a lot of the stuff that's now coming out from Michael Sandel and Thomas Friedman and people like that. The argument, it's an interesting argument, is that these are people that felt like these elites have pushed them around for years, right? And so there's a kind of vengeance. I'm not going to listen to them and I'm going to discredit them. And I think that may be at play here, particularly government, because government in some ways people feel is run roughshod over their rights, right? I would say that I think the very search for vengeance is a kind of a pragmatic mastery thing. I'm going to pay you back for exactly what you do to me, and I'm not going to let you, you know, I really do think I'm going to assert my control and mastery by inflicting on you or disregarding you. So I think I agree with you. I think the motivations may be far more complex when you start getting into scientists making recommendations about the virus, okay? But I guess the problem I have is that too would be using your pragmatic world to deny the validity of any scientific claims, right? So even if it's a matter of vengeance against the government, you're actually denying the validity of these claims. You're just saying, no, that's not true. This virus isn't serious. I mean, even though it seems to me like there's plenty of evidence there, scientific evidence.
Thank you. Okay, Vijay, last question, please.
For most of us in Rome here and other parts of the world where we're dealing with nearly 15, 16, 20 different students from all over the world, it just struck me that when the pandemic came, how at ease almost, not totally, but at ease, some of our students from parts of Africa were, having lived through Ebola and other moments like that. And I'm just a little concerned that this is seen as such a distinctive moment that you don't have this broader swath of learning collectively from what it means to be an informed citizen and obeying orders and using tools in different ways from other cultures in many ways. You've got these two things going on. If you spoke to the average African American, they certainly know what it means to be an informed citizen about police brutality and how not to trust. So you've got these two contra movements. The one is this isolated, almost solipsistic narcissism, which has been growing. And without acknowledging that that has been growing for the last 25 years, I think it doesn't help really to resuscitate a concept of an informed individual without acknowledging the failure of not listening to other parts of the world. be it Ebola or other elements, or racism in other cultures. So I'm just interested how we could use Schutz to use a broader swath rather than as a solution for this moment.
Great question.
So I mean, but if you take a look at Schutz's view, I mean, I took this essay. I only had a little bit of time, and I used it particularly. I granted it's kind of a North American situation right now, looking at the coronavirus. So I recognize the limits. I do think Ebola is interesting because you've got people, you're right, who faced that crisis before in Africa, who are experienced, who are well-informed citizens, and may not take it as something, may take the whole situation much differently because of their experience. And I do think you're right. I think that the well-informed citizen that Schutz is talking about is somebody, I mean, he was very aware in 1946 when he wrote The Well-Informed Citizen about the nuclear threat, which I thought was very interesting. So he's obviously, the well-informed citizen works on a world perspective. And of course, also it can be pretty narrow. I mean, it can be, okay, we're worried that the Russians are going to bomb us, and well, what about our injustice and things like that at the same time. So I do think you're right. The well-informed citizen should have a much more universal scope. And I actually would say it's an ideal for Schutz. It's not, I don't think he's saying, well, I can show you that there's a lot of well-informed citizens. Matter of fact, he bemoans the fact that the well-informed citizen is not even listened to in his own time. The polls just take what the man in the street says. And that's the basic thing, right?
Okay. Thank you very much, Michael, and thanks everybody for questions. So our next speaker and the last speaker today will be Sevgi Demiroglu, and your talk is the levels of irrationality during pandemics, the case of Üfürükçü, right? Sorry if I mispronounced.
No, it's
so,
okay.
Please, Sevgi.
So I'll be using that word a lot of times in this talk. So I think by the end of it, we'll all memorize what Üfürükçü might entail. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are situated in the world. And thank you so much for staying up, maybe not so late, but up to this duration. I am Sevgi Demiroglu, and I guess I can be considered an independent researcher with an MA degree, as I'm currently not studying within an institution, but looking for current doctoral options to pursue and take my studies further. Today, I'll be presenting a small work of mine titled The Levels of Irrationality During Pandemics, focusing on a special recent case of Üfürükçü that has taken place in Kayseri, a city in the central Anatolian region of Turkey, and the very Üfürükçü figure itself during these kind of times. I will use the terms religion, religious, dogmatic, knowledge, modern, individual, faith, not as loosely put words as they might sound over the course of this talk, but not as unproblematic as we should consider now that I chose to use them either, since I take the terminology from the public discourse here, outside, their spaces where I have been and I am currently, which is Istanbul. If one wishes to categorize, I am not in a position to freely put my talk through theoretical frameworks from East or West, as I'm currently just in the middle when it comes to the examples that I'll be giving from Turkey. Therefore, for this talk, I will not be quoting specifically any scholar, but please kind of feel free to make connections with earlier scholarship, some of which I have internalized in the background of this present engagement. The relation between rationality and religiosity remains ambiguous in Turkey, home to several religious practices that do not have recognition unless they pose a persistent political or economic threat to the public. The 20th century reformations, especially in the early years of Turkish Republic, supported the idea that the expression of religion and religiosity shall stay in an individualized realm, with the protection of the government against practices which can cause harassment of the individual's religiosity and religious feelings of the individuals. Accordingly, it has been considered an aggravated fraud to run practices of witchcraft, üfürükçülük, exorcism, talisman, amulet writing as a service, in a way claiming a medium between the individual and the God, a service which is followed by a prophet. I shall state what Üfürükçü not is, but rather what it may refer to in the current discourse. I see a couple of translations for Üfürükçü. As a former language graduate myself, I arrived at the judgment that neither healer or exorcist deliver the current politicized feeling that the term Üfürükçü has on people and the instances for which the term is used. Üfürükçü comes from üf, an onomatopoeic word which means to blow. Üfürük, the noun form blow, and üfürükçü, the one who has blowing as an occupation, for lack of a better term. Üfürükçü originally referred to a person who is thought to heal people with his prayers followed by breath, blowing towards the face of the believer. Nowadays, it is a larger term that is used for whomever runs the mentioned practices and whoever utilizes dogmatic reasoning to cure diseases and makes money out of it. Such that even some scholars of religion who give speech about the sacred scripts also get accused of being a üfürükçü when they happen to give suggestions and instructions that do not match with the current scientific modern reasoning. Visiting üfürükçü for biological, social, and psychological concerns is not a new phenomenon in the society currently also, although not so common or appreciated. However, its emergence in the public interactions, its emergence in the public discourse at the time of pandemic, and in fact, its threat of a possible spread through breath and other interactions it entails is a significant motivation behind this preliminary criticism of mine with the way the visit of üfürükçü blurs the individual boundary of the individualized religious and the politicized public sphere that has been tried to be put. It can also be extensively argued that individual engagement with dogmatic reasoning pose a threat to the public and the advancement of modernity and the secularist precautions of the government. However, the rise in üfürükçü in the time of pandemic gives deeper insights about how the individual finds his faith to be the closest trustable source of cause and reasoning at the time of uncertainty, which we generally call, and how the political public sphere urges the individual to seek its own medium for reaching the ideal savior or a solution itself when it admits its own ambiguities. These ambiguities do not only consist of not having come up with a vaccine or any other forms of treatment, but also the confusion over political decisions about wearing a mask itself, the bans on wedding receptions where the attenders hold hand in hand to perform collective corporeal dances, sending out young adults to military services with celebrations, the quarantine procedures, especially in rural areas, and the very measurement of social distancing. Amid such, on 11th May 2020, Kayseri Chamber of Medicine requested the citizens to stay home against the coronavirus and, as always, and not to go to üfürükçü this time. This announcement on their official Twitter account, which is no longer in use, which the tweet which we cannot reach anymore, which remains in screenshots of others. This announcement through the Chamber's social media account got criticized and found saddening as a sign of returning back to dogmatic ways of approaching diseases and viruses. The newspapers wrote that a üfürükçü woman visited several houses in Kayseri and caused the spread of coronavirus, and that might be the reason why he tweeted such a warning. As 30 households got quarantined in the neighborhood, the residents denied the news that üfürükçü woman spread coronavirus. The newspapers wrote that there was no case of üfürükçü, but the case of a woman who visited a house where several women came together for showing condolences for a man who died of a heart attack, which sounds pretty innocent. Whether the news were true or false, whether they were fake, the existence of üfürükçü remained a dominant figure in the social discourse in competence with the science and political decisions at this time of pandemic. Let alone the integration of religious ways of being within a public area shared by others who may contain or practice different religiously motivated engagements. The society then breaks into üfürükçü who helps, üfürükçü who deceives, whether someone should call one üfürükçü if he is good at healing, the one who believes in üfürükçü or the ones who are against one. This has been so almost all the time, considering the different ways of approaching instances in life and considering the change in the way üfürükçülük is also grounding its foundations in certain belief systems. But why is it so important now to consider this figure and its resurrection in public, political, and politicized public discourses? I argue that in the experience of the subject, it becomes rational to follow the knowledge, the one who might be having the most trial and error build up in the past, the solution that worked earlier, or the person who helped someone before, than the knowledge in the absence of a reliable medium. Accordingly, what might work better is not working. What has worked somehow earlier may as well work now. Furthermore, the fear of Üfürükçü has been rooted deeper than the fear from the invisible enemy. One can observe that the Üfürükçü, the blow, the materialization of the instructions facilitated by an individual, emerge as more reliable practice, which may as well work more consistently than the lockdowns over a weekend or 1-2 times a month without a clear explanation of how the infection works and how these timings are calculated by the media. So how does the lack of trust of the establishment in reasoning change the very assessment of reason and rationality for the individual with religiosity? In the absence of written works, I find my grandfather's true story about the lack of medicine and changing the flow of faith and reasoning towards religiosity fruitful in this present attempt of writing on an issue that is usually not taken up out of the ideal value given to the modern secular ways of reasoning in the current society. I do not think anybody has ever considered and studied Üfürükçülük in any sort of curriculum. In the 1970s, Abdullah works as a vendor in a city bazaar in Istanbul. He sells spices, herbs, which are on demand, especially by people who couldn't see any result of medical treatment for their health issues. One day he receives an A4 sheet with 30 identical Arabic verses written to be cut and used for treating warts on the skin. It comes from a relative who decides to note down the verse before he dies and inherit his wisdom on treating warts. As he gets to know people having warts and not finding any treatment, Abdullah cuts a verse, gives it to the person with instructions, with specific instructions. The sheet of paper should be rubbed on the wart while the patient utters prayers she knows. The chit later should be buried on a stream bed, on a water bed, and as the chit molders, the wart perishes as well. One day a young girl visits Abdullah to seek treatment for the wart on her eyelid. Unfortunately, Abdullah has run out of chits and the relative has passed away. She begs Abdullah for finding a way. A father of 2 teenage girls, Abdullah feels much worse because the case is a girl with a wart on her eye, which is very threatening for her self-esteem in a society at such a young age. He asks the girl to wait for a week. He asks the relatives, there is no hope. Believing in the role of faith in healing, he wants to try something out. He scribbles on a sheet of paper a verse, which probably wouldn't mean anything considering Abdullah neither knows Arabic nor can read Arabic script. The girl visits Abdullah and gets instructed properly, as Abdullah was instructed earlier by the relative. After 2 weeks, she comes back happily, thanks Abdullah, and wants to buy something for him. Abdullah kindly refuses the gift and keeps his reality to himself not to hurt her faith in healment of the ward. He comes home and his son, my father, reasons this incident out by stating that it is the faith of the person which makes it all happen. Probably through boosting her immune system, waiting for 2 weeks and linking natural healing process to the practice she faithfully conducted. In a setting as now, if Abdullah took that money, he would be considered Üfürükçü. But here it is not so, the question of the definition, but of pointing at one as so. Here it is not the resurgence of religiosity, if it can ever be so in isolation, but rather the resurgence of alternative system of shaping rationality through the person's religiosity in such a politicized setting. Well, this way of rationality later on becomes a question in psychology of religion to explore the placebo effects of religiosity in healing the body. My father's guesses about boosting immunity, having relief from stress with the faith and the chit and person's own ability to change the course of treatment gain reliability with the experiments on the placebo effect of prayer and faith. Once reorienting these insights prior to the relation between faith and reasoning, the cause of healing, one can see that the loss of hope in the modern reasoning of the contemporary medicine available to the girl actually causes this kind of an attempt, which is no longer dogmatic or superior, but in her world, compatible to the former ways of pursuit. The other example, which is more pandemics oriented, comes from a novel written during the Spanish flu pandemic in Istanbul in 1919 by Hüseyin Rahmi Gürbüzar. Not translated, but translatable as We Took Refuge in God, an unheard case, the novel depicted the entailment of reasoning to a mysticized entity in the town who is not questioned beyond his ability to reach personal lives, experiences, to protect the person if that person obeys the instructions, and of course, if the mysticized entity wishes to do so. The novel starts not so differently from our day. People do not listen to the warnings of the government. The elder ladies who go to the house of condolence say, "How do the doctors know? Physicians, heal thyself. Aren't they going to die? Didn't many doctors die of the Spanish flu this year? There is no solution to the fate of death." This is followed by a letter from that figure warning a rich family of Istanbul of the dangers posed if they do not obey the instructions, such as burning the incense sticks, maintaining full faith, and sending a certain amount of money to the mentioned address. The figure makes it clear that the applications and inquiries after the emergence of the disease in the household are not considered and cannot be accepted either. Over the course of the novel, the reader can easily hunt for modern explanations for the death of the certain people and events predicted in the letter. In the subject experience level, the friend of the family had clearly summarizes the uncertainty and the grounds of their predicted reasoning. In this kind of times, I'm quoting, "It is a tough issue to find a person who carries such a validity. I am not sure of even myself." Coming out of 1919 Spanish flu narrative to today, recently, the media has shown the fluctuations in the politics of protection against coronavirus pandemic with the mask crisis, and many other issues and that is depicted so far. The confusion over wearing a mask got solved along with the confusions over the supply and supplement. This was one of the earlier signals for the loss of trust in letting political public sphere navigate itself for the welfare of its individual. Regardless of the efforts to depict coronavirus, it preserved its status as an invisible enemy. Although invisible enemy brings up the debates over humanizing the virus as an enemy to fight against, the profession of being Üfürükçü already entails dealing with invisible enemies, invisible entities also. Therefore, one may argue that the quality of being invisible overshadows the demystification of the strong virus threat by calling it an enemy to fight against with the will of God. As the political public sphere attempts to incorporate the familiar concepts of war, enemy, and the will of God in the post-secular age, religiosity in its earlier individual sphere crosses the crude borders between these two spheres in contemporary lives here in Turkey. Due to the lack of any ordered reaction or even a commentary on the issue, it remains as a question the position of irrationality in the house of condolence, and to what extent religiously motivated gatherings for the dead shall be considered not only anti-secular, but in fact a threat to the public during the pandemic. I have discussed the impact of pandemics on the subject's religiosity and his modes of rationality, and how the helplessness supported by the impotence of its kin disrupt the laws established borders between individual and the public sphere. Accordingly, the rationality of the individual in the light of the individualized religiosity becomes more dominant as the public side of the division, if the division is there, does not favor the welfare of its individual. The distinction between the public and the individual is already a problematized issue. Well, in this article, in this talk of mine, I attempted to take the side of the individual sphere, stating it not as a potential threat to the public with publicized religiosity, but as a quite dynamic domain which gets affected by the trust in the relatively novel reasoning, and therefore alter the individual's irrationality and its approach to religiosity. The religiosity in Turkey is still intact in its intersubjectivity also, which can also be argued later on, especially in the times of uncertainty, which we are so used to call these times nowadays. In these kind of times, the prayers to God are enhanced with prayers to mediums of God to help their prayers reach the ultimate divine. There is no clear depiction of resurgence to be applied on understanding this case or the examples. However, during the pandemics, there emerges an appeal to the suspended alternative that follows the individual in life and gains strength at the time of a lack of faith in the other sources of reasoning. It is rather re-invocation of the religious against the threat that is almost compatible with the invisible religious ideal. In the lack of invisible, I should have put my fingers as quoted. In the lack of trusted resource, the rationality of the consensus is masked by the alternative relation of the individual with that of the Üfürükçü. So I don't know how many times I have said this name, but yes, Üfürükçü. Thank you so much for having me here and having listened to this talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful material, fascinating. Okay, the floor is open to questions. Okay, well, 10 new messages. Let's see here.
I think I saw a commentary on by Professor Tarakan.
Yeah, let's see. Let's just proceed in order. Let me just try to bring it on the screen. I think it's, yes, I think it's from Kosha Tarakan beginning. Yeah. So please, yeah, you want to read this comment, or maybe Professor Tarakan can voice it.
Okay, thank you, Olga. I was just pointing out to Sevgi that somewhat similar authors were there in India at the beginning of the onset of pandemic, maybe during the months of March and all. There was this collective mobilizing of the citizens as if to chase away an invisible creature, you know, by ringing of bells, lighting of lamps, etc. But slowly that got changed when the situation became really serious. Thank you.
Michael Staudigl, you want to say a few words? Are you still here? Or I think Michael left. Okay, just let's see here.
Yeah, I can actually address this commentary while waiting.
Yeah,
also.
please.
So actually, I was in India during that time. And also, I'm also familiar with these accusations and kind of the reflections of Üfürükçü in Indian context as well by designations as Corona Baba, who is actually a specialized person for addressing coronavirus with people, who was actually arrested later on in Hyderabad, Hafizpet, if I am not mistaken. So I'm glad you have brought this reflection as well in that context.
Okay, well, I have to ask the group, if you have question, could you please raise your hand to give me some kind of visual signal, because my chart just changed the direction and I'm not sure which questions came after Kosha Tarakan's comment. So if you have a question, please.
Emil Salim, do you want to take the micro?
Yes, Emil, go ahead.
Thank you, Sevgi. It's fascinating. There's something similar in Christianity as well. During the chrismation or baptism, there is the practice of exsufflation. The priest would breathe into the nostrils, so breathe the symbolizing the breathing of the Holy Spirit, and also Jesus does something with exsufflation as well when he heals the deaf and the mute person in Mark chapter 7. So we can imagine, so Jesus actually breathing to open the ears of the deaf, and then he actually spit and then touched the tongue of the mute person. And we can imagine if we were there during the coronavirus, if there is something like a pandemic at that time, we would be really against that kind of practice, but it just shows that there is something irrational about religion. If you disagree with Jesus at that time, that would be something like being not trusting. So I was wondering whether these levels of rationality or irrationality, do you think that a level of irrationality should still be maintained somehow in religion? There is something that cannot be understood. It's just a question, it's a reflection, but thank you.
Okay.
Sevgi, do you want to resonate, or shall we move to the next question?
Just quickly, like probably that is the reason why I said levels, because I wanted to state it in different times, but it does not mean that it goes linearly. What is considered to be rational in one situated condition may not be so in the other. So that is why levels, not in terms of more, but more like, you know, different kind of distributed organization and understanding rationality is what I also wanted to, you know, present here, as what is normal may not actually be normal once it is publicized or once it poses a threat to economic situation in the country currently. So thank you so much for your example also.
Thank you. Okay, Jason and then Bill.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. I'm really...
Jason.
Can you...
Okay, your sound is fluctuating. Please repeat the talk, repeat the question.
Right. Yeah, I'm fascinated by the Üfürükçü, and I'm wondering if they have in the religious community, and I'm wondering because I'm curious to know to what degree they have allowance and power to do the things they're doing. And if they have that kind of power in the religious communities, then yeah, how that works out. You know, Turkey, it's a totally different case than what we're used to here in Western Europe.
Okay, so I wouldn't consider myself as a representative of Üfürükçü community or their rights, but I can only talk from the public discourse. If a person, if even a religious authority would talk about things that would go against modern scientific reasoning and say that if you do this, you will be healed, and that kind of instruction does not go well with what we have known or what we have built up in science, that person would also be considered as not so scientific, but probably he also became a Üfürükçü who would kind of ask for, you know, who actually changed their direction to another level. So therefore Üfürükçü now has kind of a negative connotation in the discourse. And when it comes to laws, it is wrong. It is like aggravated fraud to do üfürükçülük, to do it for a profit. So you cannot actually go against that. And in fact, a lot of accusations are going on, and you can spot one as üfürükçü, but you cannot, if one is spotted as üfürükçü, that person cannot be a part of an authority. That person is against authority, because authority claims to be, you know, all sorts of problematic terms, which I might use here, which I avoid. So yes, I think that would be my kind of fragmented answer to that.
Thank you. Bill.
Thank you.
Okay, what I want to ask you about is the invisible, because you mentioned that. I didn't quite understand everything you had to say about it, but the invisible is something that interests me a lot. And I want to note, referring to what Michael Barber just talked about, in the working realm, province of meaning, what that focuses on is making things visible. It's very visible, tangible realm. Now the virus is very, very interesting, because the virus, as we know, is invisible. And so as a result, the invisibility of the virus leads to this possible overlap between a working realm and other realms where the invisible may be more important. So that's my question, is that maybe to repeat more what you said about the invisible and how you might think that the very invisibility of the virus makes it susceptible to other realms of understanding.
Mm-hmm. So I can quote an example that I saw in an interview. There was a child on TV and they were asking him, like, what kind of precautions are you taking against coronavirus? And he was saying, no, when I say coronavirus, I'll just beat him up. So that was the statement, and actually it also had that impact on me to a certain extent. And invisible enemy has been used by many high authorities to kind of give a shape to the virus by stating, yes, we have fought this, and there is a constant invocation of the will of God by taking the power of God and then starting and then fighting against this enemy, and literally using the word enemy. And yet it is invisible, but it is still an enemy, which makes it actually embodied in the shape of almost human. And in this case, I consider that because Üfürükçü is someone who is mediating, who is actually in between the embodied and total invisibility. So here it is kind of in betweenness of Üfürükçü is for kind of talking to the subject, but also getting that medium, kind of transitioning from that very much tangible body to invisibility, which would be, kind of taking prayers from the subject to the God, or taking healment from God to the subject. So therefore, calling virus invisible in this case actually works for Üfürükçü. It doesn't embody the virus so that we can fight against, but rather we need someone who can communicate with invisible things, the things that we actually cannot see. We can take precautions, but at that time, it might be that somebody's breathing on my face might actually work better, because anyway, I cannot see the virus. So virus in that case is a very new phenomenon to deal with. And that breath has worked earlier on earlier things as well. So therefore, that medium actually works much more and kind of backfires from what we wanted to achieve by calling it enemy and embody it as someone to fight with, just like that kid when he sees the virus. So yes, that would be my answer to that. It helps.
Okay, I don't see questions anymore, so I can, if I may ask two of mine. So virus is not treated as a demon of sorts, so like it's not jinn, it's not demon, it's virus. They kind of hypostasize it differently as something invisible, but not within the hierarchy of demons, angels, humans, animals. Where does it fit? Yeah.
It you know how cancer and tuberculosis we can see as illness as metaphor books as well. It is just that kind of repressed passions or repressed things or a sin that has come, or a test to go through from the God.
Like
so here in the general,
okay.
Exactly. So we would consider this test to we can do this as well, we can achieve this as well. But of course, this is not a general idea in Turkey, but in a discourse where Üfürükçü takes place. So this is not, I by no means generalized.
Yeah, I understand. In terms of it not being a general idea, you mentioned Kayseri. Is it specific local to Cappadocia, or is it countrywide, this phenomenon of Üfürükçü? Is this something that you observed only locally?
It happened in Kayseri that it was there in media. It was kind of televised. So it happened. It kind of popped up from Kayseri. But
Kayseri.
Yes, I can just call, because later on I also went through the discourse that happened in social media, and they said, oh, like we are back to Üfürükçü times, or this person is Üfürükçü, and then it is not geography specific that Üfürükçü word is used. I mean, I haven't been to Kayseri, but yeah, that was the newspaper.
Well, it's very interesting because the origins, the Christianity in Anatolia, the pre-Islamic layer is associated with Kayseri. That's the place where St. Basil the Great lived, St. Basil of Caesarea, So that's Kayseri, and then you have, of course, all those old Christian sites in the Hlara and in Görem, in Cappadocia. So what Selim mentioned earlier, a reference, what Emil mentioned earlier, a reference to Christian practices of breath. Do you have material that can possibly wind its practice to its roots? There is a lot of crossover between early Islamic practices and esoteric practices of Christianity, such as zikr, for example, and the prayer of the heart, or other types of contemplation, the practice of awareness. So I was just thinking that where did this habit come from? You have also Zoroastrians living in this area early on. So Kayseri is an interesting place. Or if you know, if it may be very far-reaching questions, and there may be no means of tracing it.
Actually, this case happened in Kayseri, but I might also find people whom I can accuse of being a Üfürükçü around this house as well, like anywhere in the country. But yes, it's an
anywhere in the country.
And anywhere also, like outside also, I mean, as I just mentioned, Korona Baba would also be considered Üfürükçü, the person who utters prayers or who actually gives a sheet of paper and instructs a person to do certain things in order to be healed. A person who mediates between, you know, God and the person in this case. But yes, while going through the literature myself, I tried and they saw that. So the person to whom I would go actually uses the terms from Islam, but yet the practice itself also has a lot of pagan practices in it. The ways of, you know, talking about water or writing about amulet and so on. So I am still on trying to find the actually I was planning to go to the field itself. Hopefully I will someday, but that is also interesting how they actually do not fit into anything written, or a lot of people
not Quranic, nothing Quranic, right?
Exactly. That I mean, it can be considered that breath is something important, but you cannot pray to a medium for reaching the God. You can directly, you know, the reasoning is very much on the side of the individual rather than making profit out of this kind of practice.
Last question.
Yes, sure.
How do they deal with the habit of kissing shrines? Because, I mean, you know, this is such a sacred ritual. You go, for example, to Rumi shrine in Konya, and then everybody is kissing the turbans and of the, you know, oh, you haven't seen that? I mean, in Istanbul, yeah. It's a lot of kissing going on every burial. So, and it's an essential, you know, practice, because people with very disenfranchised people look for healing from those, you know, from veneration of saints through this direct contact. So how is it?
I don't know. I haven't done it, or I haven't talked to anyone who does it. But what affected me the most was that after going through certain experiences in life, I got the habit of praying and breathing on the door while leaving the house, as if, you know, locking that door, kind of creating a psychological barrier so that nobody would enter the house before I come back. So then I was like, oh, how would it work with masks on? Because my breath is not reaching which actually, like, this webinar also came after or during that time. So I was like, I should definitely write something about it, but it cannot come from my own experiences. That wouldn't be, even this is not so academic, but that wouldn't be so, you know, well grounded. So actually earlier also, as you know, I was working on self-flagellation, coming together, and self-flagellation works with that actually collective. I am working on collective intentionality, so it doesn't, you know, it kind of goes against with the social distancing and all. So I haven't talked to anyone who kisses the shrines, but I can kind of relate to that, you know, the efficacy of doing that is not actually met when something else comes in between. In fact, because even putting a medium between things, as it might be God and subject, here you're also putting a barrier between shrine who is connected to God, and then you who is the subject of belief, and then something else in between. And mask is not at all organic in this case. There's something man-made, something.
Yeah, that's very, very important. Yeah, the embodiment, the tactility of it. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, of course, these are my
Very
own like
interesting.
interpretations, which I mean, there is absence of this kind of literature written on current issues. And
yeah. You remember comments to Zanjir paper, and I want to reiterate again, what we need for publication is a very clear description of practices. What you saw, where, all the local names, all the histories you can collect, and then your own interpretation, not because there is very little in literature on the actual description of those rituals, and usually the concepts are transplanted and often inadequately. So what you're saying now is very, very good. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so we are gloriously at the end of the first day, and tomorrow we have a very, very busy day. Let's see. Beginning a little bit later, beginning at 3 p.m. Vienna time, with a keynote of Trip Fuller and Sarah Lane Ritchie. And